Hi guys, we're back for part 2 of our article. Remember, we are reading Stan Lee, creator of A Galaxy of Marvel Superheroes, dies at 95 from newsela.com. Lee brought comic book characters to life in the 1960s. He hit his stride in the 1960s. That's when he brought the Fantastic Four, the Hulk, Spider-Man, Iron Man, and numerous others to life. So obviously we know that Stan Lee is responsible for bringing these superheroes to life. Okay, he is the one that created them. It was like there was something in the air. I couldn't do anything wrong. This right here, this statement, it sounds like he's pretty confident in himself. His heroes, meanwhile, were not just do-gooders, unlike Superman from rival DC Comics. The Fantastic Four fought with each other. Spider-Man was convinced to do superhero work by his alter ego, Peter Parker, who had to deal with things like crushes and dandruff. The Hulk was known for his hatred of himself. Daredevil was blind, and Iron Man had a weak heart. So you can see that even though Stan Lee created these larger-than-life superheroes, they all still had some weaknesses. And again, Stan Lee wanted those superheroes to connect to real humans like you and me. Jeff Klein was the executive producer of an animated show on TV. He said, "The beauty of Stan Lee's characters is that they were characters first and superheroes next." Symbols of social change: Black Panther, Savage She-Hulk. Some of Lee's creations became symbols of social change. The inner turmoil of Spider-Man represented 1960s America. So it sounds like that the 1960s in America were kind of difficult. So some of you may know the history of America, and definitely Spider-Man did have some of those inner disturbances or weaknesses. The Black Panther and the Savage She-Hulk mirrored the travails of minorities and women, so the hardships of minorities and women. So he wanted to make sure that he was able to connect to everyone. Lee scripted or wrote most of Marvel's superhero comics himself during the 1960s. This included the Avengers and X-Men, two of the most enduring superhero groups. In 1972, he became Marvel's publisher and editorial director. 4 years later, 72 million copies of Spider-Man were sold. So in 1972, he became Marvel's publisher and editorial director. That is some good factual information. Even 72 million copies of Spider-Man were sold. He became our Mickey Mouse, meaning Spider-Man became Mickey Mouse, or just as big as Mickey Mouse. Everybody knew who Spider-Man was, just like everybody kind of knows who Mickey Mouse is from Disney. He once said of the masked web-spinning crusader, "Mickey Mouse is the character most people think of when they think Disney." So again, Stan Lee is trying to say that when people think Marvel, they think Spider-Man, especially back in the 1970s. Okay, our next subsection, X-Men and Spider-Man hit the big screen. The first big budget movie based on Lee's characters, X-Men, was a smash in 2000, earning more than $130 million at North American theaters. Spider-Man did even better, taking in more than $400 million in 2002. Stanley Martin Lieber, that is Stan Lee's real name, Stanley Martin Lieber, was born December 28, 1922 in New York. He grew up a fan of Hardy Boys adventure books and Errol Flynn movies. He got a job at Timely Comics after graduating from high school. Here's some good factual information about him that you can definitely use in objective summary. Within a few months, the editor and art director quit, meaning the editor and art director of Timely Comics quit. This left the 17-year-old Lee with creative control over the company, which eventually became Marvel. Lieber changed his name, thinking Lee would be used for silly little comics, and he would keep his real name for writing books. So, if you ever see the name Stanley Martin Lieber, please know that you're also reading about Stan Lee from Marvel Comics. His early work and early years of comics. His early work largely reflected popular movies, westerns, crime dramas, romance, whatever was the rage or whatever was most popular at the time. He worked for about 50 cents per page. Lee spent some time in the Army during World War II writing for training films. Then he was back at Marvel to begin a long and admittedly boring run of assembly line comic book production. In the 1950s, the government was worried about the impact of comics on children. They didn't want comics to show violence. They also didn't want them to encourage children to disobey authorities. This limited the kind of comics that could be created. Guys, you know a little bit about the 1950s and comic books. If you remember reading The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, do you remember how the young boy came up with the idea that the aliens were coming because he saw it in a comic book? So this is real life, okay? We watched The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. We heard that the boy said that the aliens were coming and he got it from comic books, and all the adults said that he shouldn't be reading comic books. Well, that was actually true. Okay, so Lee felt that he was limited to the kinds of comic books that could be created. Lee said he was also working for a publisher who considered comics as fair only for children. One day I said, "This is insane," Lee told The Guardian in 1979. "I'm just doing the same type of stories as everybody else. I wasn't taking pride in my work and I wanted to quit. But my wife said, 'Look, why don't you do the kind of comics you want for a change?'" So it sounds like Lee kind of had to take a step back from what he was doing so that he can make a revolutionary change in comics and do what he wanted to do. The Fantastic Four comics hit stands in 1960. The result was the first issue of the Fantastic Four in 1960, with the characters, plot, and text from Lee and the illustrations by famed Marvel artist Jack Kirby. The characters were normal people changed into reluctant or resistant superheroes through no fault of their own. Writing in Origins of Marvel Comics, Lee described the quartet this way, meaning the Fantastic Four, meaning, remember, quartet means four. So he says the characters would be the kind of characters I can personally relate to. They'd be flesh and blood. They'd have their faults and foibles or weaknesses. They'd be fallible or imperfect and feisty or spunky. And most of all, inside their colorful costume booties, they'd still have feet of clay. The Amazing Spider-Man followed in 1962, and before long, Marvel Comics was an industry behemoth, meaning it was a monstrous industry. Here is our last subsection. He also worked for Marvel rival DC Comics. Lee's direct influence faded in the 1970s as he gave up some of his editorial duties at Marvel. But with his trademark white mustache and tinted sunglasses, he was the industry's most recognizable figure. He lectured or spoke widely on popular culture. Lee continued to do work for Marvel and at one point went to work for DC Comics to reinvent Superman, Batman, and other signature characters for Marvel's one-time rival. The dapper, friendly comic book genius continued to work into his 90s on numerous projects including comics, films, and DVDs. And if you're a really big Marvel movie fan, you will see that he makes an appearance in almost every movie up until his death. Lee is survived by his daughter, Joni, and a younger brother who also worked in comics, Larry Lieber. Okay, and that is the end of our article. So, With that being said, if we scroll back up to the top, I did a lot of highlighting for you when it came to factual information about Stan Lee. I'm sure if you reread the passage, you will be able to pick out even more factual information about him. Keep in mind that we read about Stan Lee, the creator of a galaxy of Marvel superheroes. We were able to learn about his career and the beginning of it. We were able to learn a lot about what he did for Marvel Comics and superheroes in general. We also pointed out some information based on the characters that he created. In addition to, we were able to understand that Stan Lee wanted his superheroes to be more like humans. He wanted to be able to connect to them. And we know that he was really confident in himself as well. So as we scroll through this one last time, again, make sure you go through this and see if there's anything else that you can pick out. Remember, our vocabulary to know is at the bottom, but we reviewed that at the beginning. If you have any questions about this reading, please reach out to your language arts teachers.